Good evening, and thanks for joining me once again for another roundup of Azure Synapse Analytics news. Now, I say good evening because I'm filming in the middle of the night because work is crazy getting ready for SQL Bits next week. Now, obviously, it's only next week if you are watching this on the 2nd of March 2022, which is when I'm filming, obviously, otherwise it's a random date to pull out. If you're watching this from the future, hello future people, you can go back and watch recordings from SQL Bits. I'm sure it was great. Hopefully there's no big massive disaster. All fantastic stuff. If you are with me in the here and now, then next week at SQL Bits, we're doing a full day training session on how to be a data engineer using Azure Synapse Analytics. So we will be going through all things Spark, serverless SQL Pools, integration pipelines, having a little look at Data Explorer, Purview integrations, Synapse Link, the works of all the stuff that is inside there and how you build a lake house out of it. So if you're going to SQL Bits and you are watching this before SQL Bits, we are doing a training day. There's still time to sign up. We're looking pretty busy, but there's still space. So off you go. Anyway, we're mainly here to talk about the news and updates. Now, there's not masses of changes. There's not a lot going into Synapse this month. There's a couple of changes on the SQL serverless side. There's a few changes on the integration, pipelines, mapping data flows kind of side. There is not a single change on the Spark engine. You guys know I love Spark. It just makes me sad. Come on, we need more Spark changes. But we'll have a look at what those changes are on the SQL side, and we'll have a bit of a play about what that actually means for us. If you are new around here, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know down in the comments what you think of these changes, anything that you're particularly excited about, anything that you wanted to see that we are missing. Always good to hear from you. Okay, let's go and have a look. All right, as usual, we have the update blog. So these days, the Synapse team put out this monthly update saying, here's all the changes we've bundled together. Go and have a look at all the juicy goodness we have put inside Synapse this month. There is, as usual, a bit of a roundup by Ryan on the Synapse PM team. That's kind of a little short, sharp run through of what the changes are. And as always, go and listen to how they describe it and how they actually put it. Don't just take my word for things, because, you know, I'm biased because I just love Spark so much. Okay, right, let's have a look at what's actually in here. And as I said, you know, spoilers, there's quite a short list of things that have gone in. So on the SQL side, we're seeing two main things. We're seeing one, they have tried to make performance better for serverless SQL pools. Or at least performance more predictable. There would occasionally be little spikes of poor performance, and they've done some work to fix it. They've also added some functionality when you're opening JSON in serverless, and you've got this horrible gnarly nested things, and you're trying to pull things out of a nested array. The ability to do things like give it an ID to the child items inside there. Really cool, interesting stuff. On the integration side, do things like upserts into a database. Useful. But what? We'll talk about it. And then some things in terms of data flows, such as transforming dynamics data, which is interesting. And then some more assertion stuff. So we'll have a look through those bits and pieces. So first things first, this idea on serverless making it more consistent. So if you've been using serverless SQL pools for a while, you might have seen this occasionally. So you run a query and it's fine. You run a query, you run a query, you run a query. You run a query and it just sits there and takes a while. And then the next query is fast again. It's like, what happened? And because serverless is so black box, you can't really get into the engine and take a look and go, hey, what did you do? Where did that go wrong? Why was that sat waiting for a while? And there's whole benefits in that, right? It's meant to be super easy so you don't have to think about that stuff anymore. But it does mean when there's a blip, you feel a bit powerless. So this is essentially something that kind of the team have acknowledged and said, this is happening occasionally. We're seeing this big blocking request and then subsequent bits of work just wait for it to finish. So essentially the change that they're making is if they notice something's taking a bit of a while, they'll spin up another try, another kind of child request. And if that actually starts working, they'll dump the one that's taken a while and carry on from there. Essentially a bit of a, just if it looks like it's slow, try it again and move on and just get the job finished. Don't sit there waiting for things to return, essentially. So really hard to actually dig in and have a look at that and actually diagnose it and say, is that what's happening? Is it going to fix my problem? It's really hard unless you're just trying it. But if you've been using serverless and you've noticed that behavior of occasionally there'll just be a little slowdown spike in your query patterns, Or if you test it out a while ago and you're like, no, it's a bit inconsistent, it's not going to do what I need it to do, it's worth revisiting and having a bit of a play and going, right, has this fixed any issues that I had? Because they've been tinkering in the engine, fixing and improving these things. Now, I know that's a weird thing to be publishing as a, hey, we made a change. Because essentially it's black box engine work behind the scenes. And a lot of systems don't really tell you they've done that. There'd be a little line saying, we've done some optimizations. It's a release, of course there's some optimizations, don't worry about it. But it's good that they're addressing specific problems and saying, if you are seeing this issue, try it again. Might go a bit faster now. So definitely interesting, definitely worth revisiting if you haven't looked at it for a while. Okay, then we've got OpenJson. So specifically, rather than the open row set and giving it a JSON type and having a play with it, using OpenJson and digging in and actually starting to have a play with that, there's some functions very similar to Spark. So if we're in Spark Pools, we can do things like explodes. We can take a gnarly nested JSON data set and say, we'll take that bit, promote it to first level thing, and just change the granularity, change the cardinality of the table by exploding these things out. And there's interesting things. But in SQL, it's always a bit orcs. It's always a little bit having to play around with things. And the specific problem that they mention is if you had a nested array and you wanted to explode it out and promote this up to be kind of the first level data set, but you wanted to maintain some kind of ordinal ID. You wanted to actually say, well, this is the first one in that thing, second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. You'd have to use an open, like a row number function. You'd have to build a gnarly bit of SQL to try and stitch it together so that it stayed in the same position when it came out. So what they're doing, there's a new function that they're talking about, this is all about, which allows you to do this kind of thing. Add in that kind of, well, where does it actually sit in my array of months? Now, apologies for the screenshot. For some reason, the screenshots in the update today are really low quality. It's... yeah, that's a bit better. So we're actually sort of seeing this kind of thing. So month ID 0, 1, 2, 3 actually sort of brought in as this kind of SQL identity thing that's kind of pulling out. So interesting stuff in terms of how it's assembled. Okay, so the bit, so we can dig in. So there's a few examples of how it's stitched together and how you then use it. Yeah, interesting idea of doing that, maintaining the ordinal integrity of child items as you explode it out in nested JSON structures. So yeah, worth having a look at. Definitely interesting. Some interesting use cases for that. However, I don't know how much we actually leave that stuff in situ. So the majority of times, in terms of the way we're working in the kind of lake housey style pattern, what we tend to see, certainly the way I tend to build things from an engineering point of view, is we'll have something landing data into a lake in its original form, or kind of converting it into something, maybe kind of landing it as horrible nested JSON as we move to getting more and more of our data from cloud API type things. We'll land it as nested JSON, and then we'll open it up in Spark, do a bit of ripping apart in Spark, land it as delta tables, all that kind of stuff. And at that point, some of the really horrible, gnarly nested stuff we'd kind of deal with as we go and pull it out and as we actually pull that structure apart. So in terms of what we do in serverless SQL, I wouldn't expect to be doing this kind of thing in an automated engineering scenario. However, before I've built any of that, before I've actually built my queries, before I've built it in such a way that I can do it, I need to explore the data and figure out what shape it is and figure out what changes I need to do to it. And for that, absolutely, serverless SQL is a nice way to go and explore it. So the more we get this kind of function, the more valuable serverless becomes as just a straight data analysis exploration, playing around with the data kind of tool. Yeah, interesting. Don't know how much its use cases in full engineering, but certainly very interesting. Okay, all right, on to our data integration changes. So we have an upsert now inside of Data Factory. So if we're doing a copy activity, or more integration pipelines, if we're doing a copy activity and saying take some data, put it into my SQL DB or my managed instance or my Synapse Analytics. By Synapse Analytics, in this case, I'm assuming we mean dedicated SQL pools. I want you to do an upsert rather than a straight insert. So we'd have three options. We can do straight insert, like just either append this to the bottom of the table or just overwrite it. We can do a stored proc. So each and every single row of data we're trying to insert kicks off its own stored proc. Then we have to map parameters and all that kind of stuff. And honestly, I don't know who does that these days. Or we can upsert. Now, upsert is saying, I want you to put it into tempDB. I want you to literally create a hashtag temp table, insert the data into there, just do a straight append of my dataset into that temp table, and then generate essentially a merge statement to say, take that temp table, merge it into my actual destination table using this key. Anything that matches that key will have an update. Anything that doesn't match an existing key will be inserted, the same as if we merged it from somewhere else. So that's the kind of thing that we've been building. Complicate. Essentially, this is just a shortcut. It's taking out a step that we'd normally have to do manually. So normally we'd be getting Data Factory to say, right, take my data, put it into this staging table, and then call a stored proc. And I'd have to write a stored proc which has a merge statement saying, take that data, merge it into there. This is how you do it. And then if I wanted that merge statement for every single different entity, I'd either have to write some horrible dynamic SQL, or I'd have to use a code generator and just generate a stored proc for everything. So if we can now say dynamically merge this data I've got in my lake into this place in a database, super useful. Really good for automating those scenarios. However, not how often we're doing this. More and more we're trying to follow the lake house style architecture. So we're saying I want to get my data into a lake, shape it and curate it and get it into good analytical models, and then serve it directly from my lake using serverless SQL pools in this case. Now for that, I don't want to then pick up my data, move it, and put it into another database. So for the majority of like analytical architecture scenarios, that's not actually something we'll be doing very often. Now, if you had a model and it was absolutely being hammered and you needed a really, really much higher concurrency of users, then you might do that. You might lift up your data mart, essentially you lift up your data set and put it as a data mart inside of an Azure SQL DB. So there are scenarios when you would do it. We're trying to get to the point when we can serve everything naturally from a lake and get all the power and complexity and the oomph of a lake with some of the good stuff of warehousing and all that. So useful. There's definitely scenarios where it's really useful. And for those scenarios, it makes life a hell of a lot easier. But it's not going to be part of my everyday pattern for serving out lake houses. Okay, another one that isn't my deal, but it will be massively useful for a lot of people, is the ability to work on Dynamics data directly. So mapping data flows, we can do now a source coming from Dynamics directly. We can do a sync to Dynamics directly. So essentially we can use a mapping data flow as a little data transformation engine on top of Dynamics data. And suck it down, do some transformation, alter rows. We can join it to other streams. We can curate that data set and we can write it directly back to Dynamics. So really interesting, super, super useful. It's an interesting use case in Synapse. The Synapse as this Synapse Analytics, right? For exploring and doing data analytics and crunching data and coming out with really interesting insights. This is essentially quite a fancy integration engine saying I want to build out workflows on top of Dynamics. I just happen to be doing it inside my analyticals workspace. So super interesting, really useful, loads of use cases. Odd from a analytics point of view, but it's all good. Now this one made me a little bit sad. So connect to your SQL data sources using Always Encrypted. Now Always Encrypted is essentially, it's that next level amount of encryption and protection of your data. So lots of things use things like TDE, transparent data encryption, and that's essentially the data that's stored in your database at rest is encrypted. So if someone managed to get around your database system and get to the disks, they can't access the data in there because it is encrypted. So that is like number one tick, my data is held securely. Now number two is at rest, is a transit. So if I'm sitting there on a client machine and I'm querying data, if that data is held using TDE, so transparent data encryption, and I'm just querying it, when it gets sent over, the engine, the server itself, decrypts it on the fly and sends me the decrypted data. Now, if someone happened to get hold of that packet, some kind of packet sniffer, they would actually be able to get hold of the data inside there. Always encrypted means I've got a certificate. So the data at rest is encrypted, pulled up, it's sent to me encrypted, and then when it gets to my client machine, I decrypt it and I can have a look at it. So Always Encrypted is a traditional SQL Server bit of functionality that is really, really useful. And when I saw this, I went, ooh, can we turn that on in Synapse? So you can query a serverless SQL pool and it will send you the data encrypted, and then you can give a client a decryption key and then they'll open it. That's not what this is talking about. What this is saying is the servers that you've set up to use Always Encrypted, because we're now no longer calling it from a client machine, we're saying, well, Synapse itself can talk to a data source that is using Always Encrypted, and then when it gets to Synapse, it'll be decrypted. So we can integrate, we can talk to, we can query things that are using Always Encrypted, which wasn't previously possible. So really, really useful. Means that you can have these well-secured data sources as part of your data estate, and you can still use Synapse to integrate and talk to them. Really, really good. But it's not saying that Synapse is now Always Encrypted. Not what it's saying. Cool. Other bits, we saw assets come in last time. So that is kind of our asserts come in last time, and that is our expectations. I'm saying, right, for this data set, assert that this amount is always greater than 10. Assert that this field, if this says it's category 1, this field will never be null. We can do that kind of thing. And now we've got the ability to have descriptions. So it used to be we'd put an asset name in and a type, and then if a row failed, it would have a little asset error against it, just saying, well, it failed that assertion. That's it. Now we've got these descriptions. That's just an additional enriched bit of information that each row is tagged with if it fails that assertion. Again, just makes it easier, makes it slightly better to work with, slightly easier to work with to move these assertions around. Now, what I would like eventually is that to come from Purview, to be able to plug in, hey, here's a load of assertions for this data set, and actually held those outside. Currently, this is plugged inside your mapping data flow. Because if you're using mapping data flows, you can have data quality assertions, and we've enriched the ability to document what that assertion actually is. They're really useful, really nice. So much more they can do, but they could see. And the final piece is when we're dealing with complex data types inside a mapping data flow, sometimes it'd be quite annoying to have to tell it the structure that we're outputting. Now we've got this DetectType, which can now understand complex data types and map out the structure of a struct of an array and that kind of thing, and it will automatically figure out what we're talking about in those kind of data sets. Essentially, a better quality of life. If you're working inside the expression builder inside a mapping data flow, you can now actually work a little bit better. So yeah, interesting bunch of changes. Certainly the one that's the most exciting, but also the hardest to actually see, is the performance improvements of how the engine works inside serverless SQL pools. So the Polaris stuff getting better is really, really cool, but really hard to actually just see. And it's not a new button. You would open your workspace and see a shiny new tab you can click on. But I think it should make a lot of people's lives a lot better. So it's very, very cool. But wait, there is more. So this is the blog that was pushed out, but actually earlier today, so Mark Cromer, one of the guys on the original ADF team, tweeted this out. So it's a new bit of functionality that snuck into integration pipelines, which actually I'm assuming this is going to be part of next month's new feature update. So spoilers, sorry. But essentially, it's the ability to run SQL scripts inside an integration pipeline or data factory workflow. So if we've got a pipeline and we want to do, if I wanted to run some SQL previously, I'd use a lookup. I'd have to kind of jam some SQL in there and get it to run. If I wanted to write like an update statement or a create table statement, or I wanted to just write an arbitrary bit of SQL, I'd either have to do a lookup and pretend I was querying some data and just jam the query in there, kind of a bit like SQL injection, right? Or I'd have to make a store proc. I'd have to fake a store proc. I'd have to go, well, yeah, there's a store proc, and I'll just figure out what it should do. Basically, people have been finding ways around it for quite some time. So now we've got the ability now, a new task type inside Data Factory integration pipelines of just SQL script. I would like you to run some SQL. Here's the SQL to run. Go and run it. And we can do that against Synapse. So super, super useful. Lots of things that we've been looking at in terms of running things in terms of serverless. Create a serverless view using OpenRoset over something. But I'm going to tell you from Data Factory, I'm going to assemble it on the fly. Things like that. Or even bundle that into my lookup. interesting things that have always been a limitation of lookups is it only returns one row set. So it can return multiple rows, but only one query result set can actually be returned and played with. And we've got kind of a little breakdown of what can be done now. And again, we can do this against SQL, Snowflake, and Oracle. So it's quite good. It's not just SQL sources going in, but we can write DML. So we can do some interesting things. A little note going, so technically the lookup can run update statements, but it's not recommended. You're naughty if you've ever done it. Yeah. And things like multiple query support, multiple parameter support, putting it in, being able to come back multiple result sets is a big change that we don't really have before. Now, how much that's going to change our query patterns? Don't know. Wait to see. Should you be using a store proc most of the time if you're doing things like create data statements and axes of controlling that rather than allowing people to inject random bits of SQL? Yeah, probably. But certainly opens up some more use cases, some additional patterns, some additional things that maybe we're having to find a way to work around to jam inside, and actually making up some slightly more useful ways. Acknowledging the fact that some people need to run arbitrary SQL inside their pipelines, and we can now have a proper place to do it. So really interesting to see how that's working. Interesting that we can actually sort of get the output of our SQL statements as part of the return JSON of their script statement. So yeah, very cool, really interesting. Not formally in the release notes, but probably because it came out today and we are in March. How it works. All right, cool. And that is my pile of stuff. So again, some really interesting stuff, and it's good that some of these things. So the serverless query performance, some of the JSON nested arrays, they are things people have been trying to do and they've been headbutting against it, going, no, this could be better. And it's good that there's been that response to go, cool, we'll fix it. We'll have a look. We'll make it better. So it's nice to see that activity. Again, I'm always going to complain anytime there's a month and there's no new shiny Spark things for me to play with. I'm just going to be sad. Fine. It'll be okay. I'll get over it. So, as always, thank you for watching and sticking with us. Let me know down in the comments if any of those pieces actually you go, oh no, there's a use case you've missed. We've been waiting for this because we want to, blah. Whatever it is, let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe as always, and I'll catch you next month. Cheers.